Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Designing Dialogue. We are very honored to have Marianne Goebl here today. We're going to record the whole conversation and post it shortly after on Vimeo. We're also going to mute everyone just to make sure the background is clear. And also, please say hi in the chat box. And if you have any question for Marianne, also put them in the chat box. Now let's turn to Glen Pattinson.
Thank you very much, Lucy, and good morning to you, Marianne. Where are you zooming in from today?
Good afternoon. I'm in Basel, Switzerland at the moment.
Great. Okay, well, it's like you're right next door.
Yeah.
Please, if you're listening in, please let us know where you are located. We just want to know that. And you can put that in the chat box. And as Lucy said, also put your questions in the chat box and we'll get back to them at during the Q&A. At the end of the conversation. So Marianne, we were just talking about your upbringing and how you were not particularly a design geek as a child. And I just wonder, before we get into your images, could you tell us about how you first got interested in design in the first place?
Yeah, I grew up in Vienna, in Austria, and I first developed an interest in art, in modern art first. Maybe a typical thing as a teenager. I thought the Impressionists were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, and then from that gradually I got interested in contemporary art, and then maybe it was when I was a teenager, a bit older, and you start exploring public spaces, restaurants, etc. I realized that the man-made environment was something I was fascinated with. But I really had an epiphany, I guess I could call it, when designer friends of mine took me to Milan to the furniture fair in 1999. And then I saw there was this whole world of functional things, but that also had a cultural dimension. And I was just fascinated. I think it was not something very cerebral. It was more of a instinctive interest.
And that's interesting that your first exposure to the world of design would have been through what I could call a commercial setting, because your career has been very interesting in that you've always been a very ideas-led curatorial figure in the design world, but you've also really always worked in spaces and institutional contexts that have a commercial aspect. So Vitra, which we'll go through, but Vitra, Design Miami, and now Artek. So is there a reason for that? Do you feel more comfortable in a kind of commercially adjacent space?
Well, I think I realized very early on that I was fascinated by the world of art and later than design, but that I was never going to be an artist or designer myself. So I never had this urge to create, but I think I've always had the urge maybe to connect and to facilitate and to communicate. And I actually studied economics. So I guess I studied something deliberately that would allow me to go wherever I wanted to go afterwards. And I think it was not a strategic decision whatsoever, but I think I realized that my place was always going to be behind the scenes or making something possible rather than the one who actually creates.
It reminds me of something Gaetano Pesce said last week when we interviewed him, which is that design is actually the best context in which to make an artistic intervention because you're getting right into people's houses. And I wonder if that's an idea that resonates with you.
Yes, it clearly resonated with me. I think I had this fascination for art, and I still do, I should say. But I felt that for me as a field to actively work in, it felt slightly too elitist, that it's something I enjoyed myself, but to talk about it to other people, that I would feel much more comfortable doing that with something that also has a function. It has something tangible that you don't need to explain. And then there's the aura around it that goes beyond the function. So I think I am interested in this duality, in something that has a hands-on aspect, but also, more maybe non-tangible one.
Right. Okay. Well, speaking of tangible, here we have what we thought would be interesting. We will spend most of the time this morning talking about Artek, which of course is your present role, and such a fascinating company to talk about. But we did want to touch briefly on these other two very important stages in your career. First, working with Vitra. So here we see a whole lot of Vitra. Could you talk about how you joined the company and the time that you spent there?
Yeah, I joined in the early 2000s because I wanted to work in a company that I think had both the historic and the contemporary pillar. But when I joined Vitra, they had been focusing on the office and the public space for decades, because they felt that this was actually the areas where innovation was happening, where progress was happening, and that it was the most interesting part to be in, because the home was private, right? And private, or maybe representative. You know, there were these rooms that would only be opened on a Sunday to let in guests, but for the rest of the weeks were closed. But the home was not an active place. But that changed when the internet entered the home and people started working from home again. And somehow we were back at a medieval setup where you could live and work in the same space. And Rolf Fehlbaum, who was the head of Vitra at the time, then took again an interest, because he thought it's an active home. So now it's also a place where Vitra should have a role. And so we started thinking about the home again, and what an active home would look like. And so what you see here was actually the first Vitra home collection, which is of course a bit of a trick, because there was a big portfolio already to pick products from. So maybe since we're mainly talking to Americans, Vitra in Europe is the manufacturer and distributor of Eames, Nelson, etc. So there was a whole portfolio of classics, but then we started developing new products with living designers for this active home. And that was the first collection overview picture coming straight out of the factory.
It's interesting to hear that about the idea of a neo-medieval experience of home, because of course we're now all experiencing that in the
now it's really interesting, because I reread a text that Rolf Fehlbaum had written at the time, and I had somehow forgotten about this idea of the active home and how the home is opening it up again to the outside world. And I think now somehow, back then it was maybe still more of a, I wouldn't say utopia, but more of an idea or a manifest. And now now we are clearly there. We're
like it or not.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So was your own role very much involved with commissioning artists and designers to work with the collection?
Well, at the time I was a bit too young and unexperienced to do that. So it was a fantastic, I was like, so we were in the beginning, we were two people. There was a technical guy and I was supposed to be the market side. And I was in every designer meeting taking notes. You know, I was the script girl, and I was doing research, market overview, but I was allowed to sit in these meetings, and then I was mainly working on everything that was installations, photography, communications. But having been part of the design process, I think I had a much deeper understanding what we were actually talking about than if I had been brought in at a later stage. So it was an incredible, it was just pure luck that I was there at the right time, but it clearly, I think, put me on in a place where I understood I wanted to be, and I didn't want to let go of anymore. Like being part of the development process, but then being actually the person who brings it to market.
Mm-hmm. And then there were these quite spectacular public presentations. I would say curatorial presentations of the material, like the one that we're seeing here.
Yeah, that was the first time that we dared to leave the Vitra campus, and we went to Milan. This was 2005, and it was a presentation at the Pelota. And I think before us, there was a jacuzzi. In the year before, there had been a jacuzzi company. So it was the first time, let's say, a furniture company was taking over the space, and we worked with the Burlek brothers, who were one of the strong voices of the new collection, and they had come up with the scenography of the space.
Mm-hmm. And we'll talk more about the Burlek brothers later on.
Yeah.
In fact, yeah. What about these amazing cloud structures that we're seeing?
Yeah, that was a project that Frank Gehry developed for Belux, which is a Swiss lighting company, which was part of the Vitra group at the time. And as you say, it was also called the Cloud, and it was made of a kind of Tyvek material. And I mean, this is 2005, huh? And I think it has aged very well, actually. If I look at it, it doesn't look that historic as it feels to me in my memory, because it's quite a while ago.
I agree. And by the way, of course, we see the Gehry cardboard furniture beneath as well. So there's a connection there to the objects. But
yeah, well, we were experimenting with colored edges. I don't think it had a long lifespan. It was more of a... Yeah, it's always funny to see the things you've tried out and haven't worked for one or the other reason, but it's also reassuring that we tried and we didn't just
Well, I'm interested also in hearing your thoughts about Vitra as a how can I put this, as an elevated kind of design company that has really ambitiously sought to use architecture and also those kind of curatorial presentations to reframe design, which arguably has made as much impact in the field as any museum working in design history has. So can you say a little bit more about Vitra's design identity and its strategy when it comes to that kind of thing?
Well, I think Vitra is genuinely a commercial and cultural company. And while it has maybe only started with a commercial goal, because it was started as a shop fitting company, when the second generation took over, Rolf and Bremen Fehlbaum in the 1970s, I think also the personal interest of the two brothers drove the project far beyond a mere commercial interest. And of course, the foundation of the furniture company Vitra is a collaboration with the Eames. And I guess if you work closely with the Eames and are imbibed with their design thinking, it puts a company on a completely different track. So Vitra is clearly a company where design is first, and where the designers are considered the people who have antennas for the things to come before we mere mortals feel them. And that has been really the tone that was set, and that was something that carries on today.
Mm-hmm. And then there's also this kind of talent spotting function that Vitra has had. So in addition to obviously working with the classics and these huge figures like Gary, there's also been a kind of exploratory function at Vitra.
Exactly. Just, being interested in somebody, I don't know, Zaha Hadid before she had ever built, and thinking, okay, this is a voice we want to see come to life, or the Rolex when they were still very young. Yeah, it's true. I think it's also a curiosity and not being afraid to try to work with people before they have a proven track record.
Do you think that design differs from fine art or possibly even architecture in the sense that the commercial entities within the field have a greater responsibility to play that shaping kind of narrative role rather than fine art?
Well, I think what's interesting about the design spectrum, and actually we're looking at a picture which comes from the other end of the design spectrum, which is Design Miami, is that I think in fine arts there is not industrial art and experimental art. There's only art, and of course it goes in very, very many directions. While in design, and if we just to narrow it down a bit, if we talk about furniture design or functional objects and not fashion and graphic and etc. So if we talk about design, you have on the one hand the industrially manufactured design, where yes, I believe the manufacturing partner has a very important role, but then you also have the experimental design where designers maybe are makers or work with a small group of just, let's say, craftsmen to bring their vision to life, and then you have the galleries to help them elevate their work. So I think, yeah, it's a wide spectrum, but probably at both ends you need that partner. But on the industrial end, I would definitely say, yeah, the manufacturer has a much bigger role, because we're also talking about bigger quantities. We're not speaking about one painting for which you want to find the best place or the collection where it actually belongs, but you continue making these chairs and you hope for them to find the best, the right place. And it's an ongoing. It's also not over with one piece. This is such a serially produced design piece has many lives, because it can be reinvented, it can be changed. Sometimes it has to change. So in that sense, yes, I think the manufacturer has a huge responsibility.
It has to do with perhaps economies of scale and the infrastructure of production, which is so different in design, leaving it or speculative.
Exactly, because you have to think, if you bring out a plastic chair, there's a huge investment in terms of tooling, molds, etc. And this only works out if then the chair also actually is produced multiple times.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to this next chapter. As you say, we're now looking at Design Miami, which shares this kind of talent spotting role, of course.
Yeah, we're looking at the designers of the future, 2011, I believe. Yeah.
And names that we still hear, by the way. So that's absolutely true. Yeah. Can you say a little bit about your role at Design Miami, which of course was a very significant one? And
so after a decade, roughly at Vitra, I joined Design Miami as the director of the fair, and it's a very small team, dynamic small team. So my role was as director, I guess, both the curatorial direction and the financial responsibility, but I should say I had a very, very strong team who also took over certain aspects of the curatorial role. And I think Design Miami, it's called a global forum of design. And I think that it insinuates already, it's a marketplace, but it's not only a marketplace. And what was particularly dear to me is that we had the opportunity also to create these vessels for designers or also architects, and especially I think in America, where there is not that many opportunities for young architects to build at an early stage of their career. What we're looking here actually was an entrance pavilion of architecture. We had the possibility to give them a platform to not only work, but also to expose themselves, to engage with people, to become part of the community.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of the way that the Serpentine Pavilion has functioned over in London as a kind of setting for temporary experimental architecture. And that's certainly something that Design Miami was doing in a very high profile way.
Yeah, that here was a design performance by Judith Seng, and that was now on the Basel side of the show. And it was a huge new fairground building by Herzog and Dameron. And we took a quite bold stance to say, okay, let's not build it out, but let's put a stage inside and have actually people interacting. It was, I think Design Miami, especially in the US, but also in Basel, I think has quite a unique position within the fair circuit. That's another entrance pavilion that we did with Formless Finders. I think that was 2013.
Can you say a little bit, Marianne, about the context of Miami? For those that have been, they'll be very well aware of this, but here you have a design fair that's really cheek by jowl with all of these art fairs. So you have a very strong sense of, I guess, juxtaposition. I was going to say competition, but I'll just say juxtaposition. And I wonder whether projects like this were a way partly of, I suppose, opening up design to the conversation with fine art practice. How did you think about those relationships?
Well, that was something I had completely underestimated, because I was a design animal, walking into this fair thinking everybody cared about design, and having to realize that there's a friendly interest in design, but everybody actually cares about art. I mean, the majority of the people coming to Miami came for the art fair. Of course, we have our own very strong community, but yes, it was clearly our ambition to convince people who are normally only looking at art that it's also worthwhile looking at the functional objects, and also to show that design and the main man-made environment is something they should care about. And by creating these public spaces that were open to everyone, you didn't need a ticket to the fair, we obviously wanted us to make that point, that by intervening in a spatial way, you can make a huge impact. So yes, it did have also a bit of a beacon function, because it stands in front of the tent, so people could see it from far away that something was happening there. But it was a mix of, there was a mix of goals, but I would say like this creation of a community outside of the fair, independent of the commercial program, was also very strong reason.
Can I ask you a maybe slightly more provocative question about that, which is whether you think Design Miami actually changed the way that designers work? And I'm particularly thinking here of the fact that Design Miami, having this presence next to all these art fairs with all these collectors coming through, that your years there really overlapped with the rise of galleries like Friedman Benda, Carpenter's Workshop, Art and Company.
Well, I actually would hope that it facilitated that designers can also live by concentrating of more experimental work. Because I think there were always designers that worked in an experimental way. There was not necessarily a market for them. And also if you think of education, I mean, the educational design system has been fostering experimental design for many years now. And these designers are not necessarily trained to go and work in industry. Huh? They're trained in design thinking. And I think Design Miami is one of the outlets where they actually have the possibility to hopefully also turn that into something that supports their living.
Mm-hmm. So you were really then quite conscious of creating an economic ecosystem in which more experimental design could be supported.
That was definitely one of our hopes. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and that also made Design Miami, at least in my experience, it made it feel much less like a trade fair and more like an art fair. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, and also, I mean, to be honest, of course, the work for sale, comes from a certain end of the price spectrum also. So in that sense, it is much closer to an art fair, also because many of the pieces or most of the pieces are limited or unique pieces. So it doesn't have the vibe of a commercial. Also, it's not commercial in the sense that everyone can go. While Milan, the fair, you still need to be part of the industry. It's not open to the general audience, or maybe there's one day where people can come. While Design Miami it's open to a broader audience.
It's a public experience. I know we now want to turn our attention to Artek, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you this question, because I'm sure so many people are wondering. And obviously you're not with Design Miami now, but what do you think the future of the fair as an instrument of culture is going to be, given everything that's happened this year? Do you have any guesses?
Yeah, I do. I had the feeling over the last years there was really a proliferation of fairs that was maybe beyond what we could actually keep up with as professionals. But I strongly believe that people need to physically interact, and especially when it comes about objects or furniture that you also as a user physically interact with. I think just moving to a virtual way of communicating, a solely virtual way of communicating, is taking away something that's like a human need, like I think this idea of trading and exchanging, and it's something that it has been part of our culture from day one. I mean, since we started walking upright. So I think there will be a kind of a purification. I think not all of these fairs maybe will be sustainable, but I strongly believe in the format of the fair as a place to bring together people, and I'm absolutely sure that the ones who take an interesting position and by that bring interesting people together will have a future.
Right. So you think that there will be a kind of Darwinian situation where we may lose some of the more fragile fairs, but that
I'm afraid so. Yeah.
I'm sure that's true in so many other
industries,
museums, galleries, etc. So, well, obviously our thoughts are with anybody who's involved with one of those concerns.
Absolutely. I mean, as you can imagine, having been strongly involved with the fair, I follow this very closely, and I don't think it must be a very, very tricky time. So.
Well, let's turn to Artek. I'm sure it's not a simple time for Artek either. I mean, get to that.
Is it for anyone? It's like.
But first, for those who don't know the history of the company, let's talk about it, because it's such a fascinating history. Founded, as we can see here, in 1933.
Sorry, it was actually founded in 1935, but the furniture existed already before.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, you take us through the history then, because you're the expert.
Yeah. So. Artek was founded as a quote-unquote sales and propaganda center for the new housing ideology. You know, we're full on in the 1930s, and it was founded in Helsinki, in Finland, so really at the periphery of Europe. And I think it's really a product of modernism. And it was founded by 4 people. I think we have a picture coming. One more, I think. It was founded by 2 architects, Alvar Aalto, an art historian and a patron of the arts. And it was a very happy marriage of art, architecture, and industry. And these 4 wanted to create a platform that would bring the modern life to Finland and their idea of the modern to the world. And what had started this was that Alvar Aalto had started beforehand developing furniture that got very popular, and people all over the world wanted to buy their furniture, but they were architects. You know, they didn't want to sell their own furniture. So the business idea of it was that Artek would sell the furniture of the Altos, but that they would also stage exhibitions. So modern art was one of the pillars, and the third pillar was, so pillar 1 was modern art, the second pillar was industry and interiors, so the furniture, and the third pillar was propaganda. So they had maybe you would call it today advocacy. They had something to convey, and that's what you see here is the founding manifest, where they explain exactly how they want to show things, how they want to come up with novel ways of presentations, how they want to bring together art and design and craft, and then all these arrows go down for increased worldwide activity. So they were not shy. They thought they were onto something.
It's also the fact that they would launch a company with a manifesto, I guess Finnish is manifest, also illustrates that strong connection to modernist ways of thinking. And to me, this image always reminds me of the famous Alfred Barr diagram of the Museum of Modern Art's sense of art history. You know, Cubism leads to futurism, leads to this.
Yeah.
And so there's this idea of a kind of programmatic DNA at the heart of the company, which is so interesting.
Absolutely, starting with the name, art and technology. I mean, of course, they were aware. I think for me the fascinating thing is, I don't know if we've ever any Finnish people on the call, but Finland is really at the periphery of Europe. It's still difficult to get there. And in the 1930s, it was a super young nation. It had only become independent from Russia in 1917. So I think Artek as an entity happened at the same time when also Finland found itself or found its own voice. So it was all happening at the same time. And I mean, the 30s in general were very tumultuous years all over the world. But it happened at a very interesting moment of history, Finnish history, and history at large.
You didn't have a previous existing relationship with Finland before joining Artek, did you?
Not at all. I went there once when we were discussing if I should join the company, and it was love at first sight. I'm not paid by the Finnish tourism board, but I would really recommend everyone to go. It's I don't know. It's authentic on every level. You know?
And I suppose you now have. This is a good image to look at when we're talking about authentic. I suppose you now have a very strong relationship to the country because surely, given Artek's stature as a cultural export of the country, they must look to you as a real player in the conversation about what Finland is today.
Yeah, I was really intimidated in the beginning because there is a company that was founded by Alvar Aalto and Aino Aalto and 2 other brilliant people in the 1930s, and here you come, 80 years later, not Finnish, what do you know? So I think I went into it full of respect, and I really took also my time to try to learn and understand. But they have been, like my Finnish team, they were like, oh, welcome, let's go. They were not at all suspicious of me not being Finnish. So yes, we have I'll go there very often. And by now, I'm not an honorary Finn, but I'm a self-appointed Finnish fan.
Well, let's talk about this project, the Paimio Sanatorium, which is in a way a kind of centerpiece of the early canon of Artek. And I wonder if you could tell us about the project.
Yeah, I thought it would be an interesting project to look at also in today's context, because it's actually the first modernist or rationalist project that the Aaltos designed. It was a competition in the late 1920s for a tuberculosis sanatorium. tuberculosis, highly contagious lung disease. There was no cure back then. And so patients had to be isolated. And interestingly, when the Altos started working on this competition, Alto was hospitalized himself. And so he experienced what it means to be in the horizontal. And he also said that this really impacted his whole design process in a very interesting way. And they ended up designing a medical instrument. It's like a total work of art where every detail was designed by them, because again, in the late 1920s, there was no catalog to choose a banister from, or a light switch, or at least not a one that looked like the ones they wanted to have. And so people were there for up to 3 years in isolation. This is the roof terrace where they were lying, because it was all about peace, fresh air, hygiene. And I think what's so interesting is that the mindset that the Altos already showed in this project is like a red thread throughout everything they did. They were modernists, but they didn't think that should contradict a humanist approach. They always thought, they said, well, the design process is a constant compromise. So the best way to achieve that is if you think of people in their weakest situation, because then it will also work for everyone else. And of course, in a tuberculosis sanatorium, that came to play. And I think there's a few more images where you see that they really considered everything. Finland is half the year on the dark side because it's very up north, so there's very little sunshine. How do you bring in the notion of daylight through a very specific color concept that they developed with Finnish artists? There was everything from dust-free lamps, wash basin that would make any noise. This was the canteen. Here you see the dust-free lamps where they have encased them, and again with the colorful blinds that would throw in the colorful reflections, and also the rooms. I don't know if we have a picture of a room. Maybe one more. Yeah, or they were really measuring how does the light come in, how does the water splatter in the wash basin so that it doesn't disturb the other patient. And this was the room, and you see how low the windows are, so when you're lying in the bed you can actually look outside. And the ceiling was painted in like a soothing sage green that should help also the healing process. And then, sorry, one interesting detail is these wardrobes. They're like this shaped, because there were no right angles so that you would hit yourself. But the patients were not too fond of them because they remanded them on coffins, which didn't go down that well. Yeah. And then of course the furniture, because if you are weak and frail, what's the kind of material you want to touch? Something that's warm and friendly, but at the same time it needs to be hygienic, easy to clean. So they found that wood would be the material that should be in touch with the patients. But in all fairness, Finland in the 1920s was not a very industrialized country, but there was a lot of wood, so it was also the material they had at hand. And I think you see that they knew what was happening around them. They were fascinated by the tubular steel furniture and cantilever, like this, this machine entering the home, but they translated it into a material that they felt was more appropriate.
It was fascinating to see that picture earlier of the incredible forest around the sanatorium as well, because we so often talk about Scandinavian design as having this warm, organic, soft, modern quality, and the selection of the material is a big part of that. But when you realize how much wood and how much wood,
I think two-thirds of Finland are covered by forest. No, it's around.
So it's also a matter of them using really one of the few resources that they had available to them and really industrializing it.
Exactly, and innovating how to process it, etc.
Yeah. I also just wanted to note that when you see particularly an image like this one, or the staircase that you showed, it makes you realize how much of modernism you lose when you only look at it in black and white photography. Here we're very lucky to have a sense of what the original colors of this space would have been.
Yeah. No, this is a picture I took last year, so it's still, because it's still active. It's not, of course, a sanatorium anymore, but it's used by families with children with special needs, so they can retreat there. And yeah.
So not a totally different usage then.
Yeah, but I mean, it's far less people, and yeah, it's one of these. Ask the question: what happens to these fantastic modernist buildings? Yeah.
So here we see an incredible image of Aino Alto, who perhaps is not as well known to our audience. Can you talk a little bit about her?
Yeah, I have to say that was particularly fascinating to me to see the roles of women at Artek. So you saw it was 4 founders, 2 gentlemen, 2 women, but I think it's fair to say that the 2 women were the driving forces. So I know Alto, she was a trained architect, and actually Finland was one of the first, even the first country in Europe where women were allowed to study architecture. And she became Artek's first creative director. And she ran an interior design studio at Artek. So most of the architecture projects of the Alto architecture studio, the interiors were done at Artek by Aino. But she was also Alto's partner on the architecture side. So she worked on both sides. And
you have a sort of standard gender division there for the time, in the sense that you have the woman looking after furniture and furnishings, and you have the man being the architect of record, but that shouldn't distract us from how much she was.
Yeah, and also how I think she also had her own agenda. You know, she was very interested in education. Her sister was a Montessori teacher, so she was doing many kindergartens. They were doing a library where there was the first children's book section, or it was actually the first library where you had free access to books. So I think she was just also very different character from Alto. Apparently she was very reserved, while he was very charismatic and outspoken. But she also passed away already in 1949, while Alto lived on to 1976. So he had another 3 decades, but they worked together for 25 years. And she was a driving force on many things, and definitely at Artek.
So some points of comparison there to the Ameses, of course, Charles and Ray Ames, that were the founding of Vitra. So that's quite interesting that there's that parallel.
Yeah, it's interesting. But also it's really interesting to see how strongly Aino still resonates with our team today. Like our Finnish team, for them, Aino is a hero. You know, like they of course they admire Alto for many things, but they are particularly inspired by her and by what she did.
You had also just mentioned to me, because this is such an interesting picture, I think it's worth just spending one moment on it, that they were very close with Lucia and Laszlo Mihaly-Nagy from their work at the Bauhaus. So the style of this photograph is
clearly, yeah. I mean, they were part of the gang. Huh? They were members of the CIAM, of the Congress of International Modernist Architects. They were traveling, they were corresponding. I mean, Alto was teaching at MIT. He had his first solo show at the MoMA at the age of 40 in 1938. So they were extremely well connected, and they were part of this modernist movement. And I think that also led ultimately to the foundation of Artek, because they did this furniture. Their friends loved the furniture. They wanted to use it in their projects. They wanted to buy it. The Altos didn't want to, manufacture and produce furniture. They needed to set up some kind of company to take care of that.
Yeah, but then of course it does become this kind of international phenomenon, which involves resource management and sort of managing of the brand and everything. So let's now leap ahead in time a little bit and talk about how the legacy of the company has unfolded and your own stewardship of it.
Yeah, so it was set up in 1935, and they had done a few major technical innovations in terms of wood bending, and this was the foundation of the Artek collection. Clearly, it was the furniture and the lighting by the Altos, and the core piece is this like L-shaped leg. I'm not sure if we have a picture of that coming. Yeah, exactly. The stool, who probably many of you've seen either in its original or in its copied version. And so what do you do like 80 years on if you work for a company that has been founded by these geniuses? I think the one thing is like you really try to understand the essence, and also of the company as such, but also of the products, and to see are they still relevant today, you know, and or maybe is it just something little bit you need to change to keep them relevant. And one fascinating project that was started by my predecessor was that they started buying back pre-loved alto. So what we see here is actually these are stools from the 1940s, and they're so beautiful. No, they have and they're not, I think you also see that people just make them their own, because this yellow-orange combination, pretty sure just somebody lacquered it. Also the green one, the radius, it doesn't look as if it was painted in the factory. So these are products that people repurpose or intervene upon. And so we started buying it back and making it available again. So one part of Artek is also, it's a bit of an ecological maybe also strategy to say, yeah, you can have the new one, but there's also one that has already been around for a while. And so we have one store in Helsinki, which is called Artek Second Cycle, and it's this Alibaba cave where things come together. And we have a few clients who prefer the pre-loved. I think the next picture shows that's the Rose Bakery at Dover Street Market in London. And it just said, you know, we're moving with the cafe. We need 30 chairs. What do you have? And then it turned into this.
It's so beautiful, in fact. But it's also, it seems really smart to me, because I don't know if this is true of Artek, but I know a lot of manufacturers that have been around for such a long time sometimes feel that they're in competition with their own old products, because of course they continue to circulate. And so to get on top of that and actually help manage the process and also keep an eye towards ecology, that seems like a really smart way of going at it.
And of course, it's only, as you say, there's so much around. We only deal with a small part of it, but we're very happy that the others are still around and find a new and like a new application. I think it also just shows when you buy a new piece, it will at some point look like that. So it helps us also to explain how things will change over time.
Yeah, just wait.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this question of aging is very interesting, because people are somehow fascinated with vintage furniture, but other than that, things have to be mummified, you know, like they are not willing to go through the process. So I don't know, the analogy of the white sneaker, right? You buy the white sneaker and then you want it already to be worn in, but the in-between is tricky. But it's the same with furniture. I'm sorry, like you need to make it your own and put on your stamp.
Well, it's also just interesting thinking about the identity of modernism, because of course when it was new, it was really new, and it was a real rupture in what people expected. And the idea that it could now be, you know, that an Artek chair could be like a well-loved old shoe, that's quite an amazing adjustment to the legacy of modernism that I guess only became clear over time.
And it should be the shoe, and it should not be the statue, you know? It should be something that just serves you.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I like about Artek, that the products are all clearly there to serve. You know, they're there if you want them, and if you don't want them, they leave you alone. They're not there to attract unnecessary attention.
That's another question that I did want to ask, and we're now going to talk about your collaboration with a couple of leading designers, beginning with Helen Jongerius. But is that, well, what are your thoughts on being the steward of such a simple brand? I don't mean that the actual brand itself is simple, but the imagery is about simplicity and straightforwardness, even as you say, a kind of self-effacement, which is maybe not what people think of when they think of leading design. They think of some kind of grand statement. But there's a kind of whispering quietness to what Artek has always been.
Yeah, I think for me it is very relieving because I think we don't need to. I think the products are so direct and they don't pretend to be something they are not. So we don't need to come up with, you know, there's nothing we need to explain other than there's always a reason why the things look the way they look. And of course it doesn't appeal to everyone, but it's not a product that you have to or want to talk somebody into. And it's really interesting to see. I mean, in Finland, of course, it's a very specific case because their Artek is really part of the national identity. And there it was really beautiful for me to see how now the next generation is interested in it. And the other market where we're very well received is Japan. And I think that makes sense, no? To think that an aesthetic like the Japanese one responds very well.
Yes, the land of Muji and Marie Kondo.
not only.
For sure, not only. Yeah, they also
yeah.
have Nikko Castle, right, which is like Las
Mm.
Vegas on its best day. But let's talk about working with Helle Jongerius, because I suppose one could say she's a great choice for the brand because of precisely what you just said, because she's such a subtle manipulator of materials and color. And we're starting here with this image that is so wonderfully resonant with the earlier one that we saw of Alto, which is great.
Yeah, true. We could overlap them.
Great pairing. Yeah. Can you talk about how you came to work with her at Artek?
Yeah, so I mean, Helle, we had worked together before, and she actually had already done a project for Artek before I joined. But I was very happy she was already in the mix, because as you say, she also, I mean, you've probably read all her recent publishings, that she doesn't necessarily believe in the new. She thinks it's also about maintaining the existing. And so I think both her, let's say, creative sensibility, but also her mindset worked very well with ours. So, for example, what you see here is a tea trolley that was designed in 1937, if I'm not mistaken, and or six, and she looked into the archives. She understood what was done, but then she also said, look, how does the light fall on this piece? The light can always only hit the upper layer. So why don't we put a slightly different color on the upper than on the lower layer? So you see the upper one has this like aubergine-ish, brownish tint, and the lower one is black. So I think it's both a very research-driven, but also a more of an atmospheric approach that she brought to it.
Mm. And similarly, the wheels have the surface of the wheels are part of that conversation.
Exactly, because in our, let's say, the standard version, the wheels are always white, and she felt it was too strong a contrast, and it should be something that's more brought into it should be more harmonious as an overall piece.
Did she similarly adjust the dimensions, or is she working?
No. With Helle, we really work on surfaces, because I think that's one thing that's really interesting with these. There is these strange creatures that we call classics, which seem to travel through time, right? Like this from the 1930s. I'm sure if you show this to your neighbor who doesn't know anything about design and say, look, this is a new product, they wouldn't be shocked. So these products have this enigmatic strength to travel through different periods. But what normally does not have this enigmatic strength is the surfaces. We know that colors, the notion of color is more more victim of fashion than form.
Yeah.
So we thought when we started, or I thought when working on the collection, the question was more that I thought the form was completely off today, but maybe sometime the finishes we needed to do some interventions, and that's what Helle worked with us on.
And so here we have a similar case where she's addressing the webbing of the.
Exactly. That's also a product I like very much, because like the webbing is super light. So if you sit on it, even in a hotter climate, it's always, like it breathes, but it gives you the comfort of an upholstered chair. But of course, this webbing, it's linen, it will, like, after a while, it will start to sag, but you can reupholster, you can re-web the chair. There's no reason, to get rid of it. You can buy that material by the meter and you can re-web it. And with Helle, we worked on a few like dual colors, very subtle, where she would always weave, like you have the warp and the weft, and the warp is either dark or light, and then the weft is an accent color, and it completely changes the character of the product. Really interesting. Like, color seems a banal approach to change things, but I think if done well, it really has a huge impact.
I have to say also, having seen the image of the sanatorium earlier, when you then see this pink pastel webbing, you realize actually it is in the lexicon of the company. It's not a radical departure from what.
Oh, that you mentioned, you always see black and white pictures of the modernist era, and also often later on, just for manufacturing reasons, companies reduce their color selection to black and white because these are the safe colors, and you cannot carry 500. It's just economically not possible. But we have these documents from the 1940s where they say all the colors they use, the different veneers, they put cork on it, mahogany, elm. They were not at all. It was not at all birch and black and white. They were playing with the full palette that was available to them. So floral prints. It was not at all a reduced aesthetics. Just the shape, yes, was very simple. But then they were going wild on the rest.
Now I'm imagining a kind of ideal marriage of Artek and Marimekko.
Yeah, well, I think Marimekko uses our furniture in most of the stores, probably for a reason.
They're also Finnish, are they not, Marimekko?
They're also Finnish. Yeah. Great company.
Here we see the finished line.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's now talk about your work with the Borlek brothers, Ronan and Aaron Borlek. So this is another similar case where you have them readdressing some of the established designs from the company.
Well, yes and no. When we the question is like, who do you work with at Artek today? Like, should we only work with Finnish designers, or should we only work with Nordic designers? And I came to the conclusion that, today design can't have a passport. Like, it needs to have a certain attitude that needs to fit to your company. But Artek, having always been decidedly international, remember, they wanted to conquer the world. We said, okay, of course we feel closer to a Nordic tradition, but there's other maybe elements of the Artek identity that we want to revive. And one of it is this idea of standardized components. Like the Altos, they invented this, like the L-shaped leg and other things that could be manufactured in series, but create very different products. And the Borleks, I think, apart from having a really poetic sensibility, they're also very strong system thinkers. They're very good at coming up with a constructive principle that you can roll out across many different things. So what you see here are very first prototypes where they were wrapping a metal band around the wood, which then led to the table that we saw on the first page, and a whole collection of products based on this, like also wall shelves and desks. And so I think it has a very clear reference to Alto. Like there is some shelves where there's wooden loops, which are maybe formally reminiscent, but it's a different, it's a new departure.
Can I ask, is that quality of modularity, obviously it has a very strong aesthetic result because you have this very unified collection of objects, but do you also try to aspire to that modularity because it actually is more efficient from the point of view of cost and sustainability?
Yes, it's for both reasons. I think that was the start of industrial manufacturing, was that you need to standardize, right? Because if you want to do everything different, then it's you're back at craft, which is another wonderful activity, but that's not what allows you to bring these things to many people. It will remain a small production. So yes, it's definitely also, it has a manufacturing reason.
Well, let's look at one other project of the Borlek brothers, which is maybe a bit more of a radical departure, which is the rope chair series.
Yeah, that's actually our brand new product. We only introduced it in February when the world was a very different place. Yeah. And the starting point for this was that the Borleks were really interested in simplicity. In French, they even called it, they said something, how did they say? Well, it doesn't come. Anyway, so they wanted to do something really simple, direct. And so we had this whole conversation about what it means for a piece of furniture to be simple and direct. And then they went back, and then they came with several suggestions, and one of them being the chair. And their idea was to say, a rope normally is used to tie together boats, or it's woven into a textile, but it's never used in a structural way in a piece of furniture. So what it does here, it's a bit like a line drawing. It shapes the backrest and the armrest. And it remains flexible. So when you sit on it, actually the rope moves and you can slouch in it. And at the same time, it looks super simple. probably looks as if you cannot sit in it, but you actually can. It's a really surprising sitting comfort.
And so here we see almost disassembled into its component parts.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the rope
Out of curiosity, this is a kind of ridiculously specific question, but how did you get the rope made? Did you actually have to go into the rope business?
No, this is the kind of thing you can source. This is maritime rope. That's rope that's being used also in boating mainly.
It's almost like a found industrial material that they're introducing.
Exactly. Yeah. And you see how it also, of course, we always have to also see, do these things that we make now, how does it connect to what we already have? But it does, I mean, it has to have its life of its own, but it also somehow needs to talk to the rest of its siblings in the collection.
Yeah, so well pitched in that respect. Like the rope talks to the L leg, but it's not a duplicate of it. It's like a kind of friendly sibling.
Yeah, and I think for me also, this notion of art and technology, what does that actually mean? It means that you do something with modern production possibilities, but it should still have a soul. It should still have something of an artistic dimension. And for me, this product achieves that.
Yeah. Here's our last image. So this reminds me of the shakers hanging there, furniture.
Yeah, well, the shakers were obviously part of our conversation when we spoke about direct. And actually the term that the Bourlex used was primitif, but it doesn't mean primitive in French. It's really more like simplicity at its core.
Back to basics.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, let's take some questions. I actually have a couple for you first, but please, if you have questions for Marianne, please put them in the chat box. The question I wanted to ask you, Marianne, first was occasioned by your use of the term craft, which is something I've written about a lot and care a lot about. Can you talk a little bit about the workforce at Artek and how artisanal it still is, as opposed to how industrialized or mechanized it is? About that?
Yeah, with pleasure. I mean, especially the furniture of the altos, it's like there's two separate boxes. One is this L-shaped leg, which we're trying to automate actually a bit more than it currently is. I would currently say everything, this is like semi-automated, and it should be automated more. And then there's the other part that we actually call the atelier product, which is done by hand, like where you have people with clamps, molding sandwiches of wood, like, which is very artisanal. So we have we have carpenters at the factory. So it's a mix of semi-automated and highly specialized craftsmen.
Right.
And we want to keep it this way. Like, it's very important to us that we keep also the artisanal part.
Okay, that's what I was just going to ask you, because I was wondering, with a company like Artek, do you actually worry about growing too much or too fast at certain times because you need to retain the right economy of scale?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because we actually were lucky enough to grow quite a bit over the last years, and we're meeting a bit the limits of the capacity at the factory. And we realize there's growth, and we're interested in an organic growth, like you see, okay, there's more people interested, that's fine, but not to the extent that we need to compromise on how we make things, where we source the material. So in that sense, yeah, there is a bit of a limit to how much we can actually grow, just by the way we make things.
Yeah, so how much you can responsibly grow, or how much you can grow in your identity.
Yeah. But I think, on the other hand, if people are interested, it's not, we're an industrial manufacturer. So it's not that we are artificially, we're creating artificial scarcity, but that we say what's really, how does this manufacturing work, and how can we keep it that way, or where would we lose the identity of the product and the company? So that's a bit the balance.
I suppose that also bears on how the company is set up, because you're still independent, correct? You're not part of a larger conglomerate.
No, we actually, Artek has been bought by Vitra 6 years ago, which is a family-owned company. So in that sense, it's not a larger conglomerate. And
so you've come home.
Yes, in a way, yeah. But in a different house next door.
So what is that relationship like then, the conversation between Vitra as a parent company and Artek?
It's interesting. I think Vitra's really enamored with Artek, like we're the smaller brand, and there's a lot of passion And yeah, I would say love for Artek, but they also let us do our thing. So we're in that lucky position that we're pretty independent when everything that comes to design management and how we talk about things, but then we can tap into Vitra resources in terms of logistics, distribution. The operations team has been extremely helpful, and yeah, the distribution teams all over the world, they help us also distribute Artek.
Yeah. And then just one last question for me, and this I suppose is the inevitable question that I asked you about fairs as well. What has this year meant for you at Artek, you personally and for the company, and how are you navigating it?
Well, I think like everyone at first, you're, okay, this is really putting everything into question, like who needs furniture in such a tragic situation? And then I think after a while you realize, well, people still need to live, like we still need to go about our lives, and we want to go about our lives in a maybe more meaningful way than before. We could become more conscious about our choices, and also as a company you become more conscious about your choices. In a way, it has turned to become something like a compass, to tell us, would we, we would have done that before the pandemic hit. Should we still do it? Like, does it still feel relevant? So it's more of a filter. But yeah, we of course see the impact. But in Europe, I have to say the situation is already recovering, and especially in Finland, the country was hardly affected. So we see a silver lining, but we're very cautious, and I think it's also healthy having this filter, having to really question, should we do that? Does the world need this from us now?
Right, okay. Well, that's as good an outcome from such a tragic situation as one can hope for.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to read one. It's not so much a question, but a comment that just to close on. Christina Panchik has said that one of, well, I don't know if it's her history professor, but a history professor has defined design as the intellectual substructure. And she says he was talking about design in the context of painting, but I think this is a good definition of design in general. And I wonder how you respond to that, the idea that the Altos and company bequeathed you an intellectual substructure that you're still building on.
Definitely. Yeah, it's a beautiful quote. Maybe you can send it to me afterwards so I can look up the full context. No, definitely. I think they have set a framework that's extraordinary, and that leaves you so much also. I think it's clear guidelines, but it also leaves you a lot of room for interpretation. So, but there is so much substance wherever you scratch. There's something there you can build upon. And it's, in the beginning, I thought, as I told you, I was very intimidated, but now I think 6 years on, but now I see it really more as an encouragement to scratch and take something and see what we can do with it.
Fantastic. Well, this has been such a great conversation, going at light speed through your rather extraordinary career, and also just getting a sense of where you're at now at Artek. And obviously we wish you and everyone at the company the best in coping with the situation, but it's been so revelatory to talk to you. I did want to let folks that are listening know that on Friday, we'll have Marianne Pestana, who is negotiating her own coronavirus implications. She's the curator of this year's Istanbul Design Biennale. So she's been having to think about what the pandemic means for her in that context. But she's also going to talk about other projects that she's done in the past that have to do with curatorial innovation and really, in a way, exploding the existing models of curation, which of course is something that you did in your previous roles as well. So there will be some good links there. But listen, thank you so much, Marianne, for coming on the program. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for listening in.